You know what the Allies never wanted you to talk about after World War II? The weapons that worked too well in the wrong hands. The experimental designs that never made it to mass production. The rare firearms that existed in the shadows of history. Today, we're talking about one of the most fearsome and frankly insane weapons to come out of World War II. A gun so powerful it could punch through Soviet tanks like tissue paper. A rifle so massive it needed its own wheels just to move around. This is the story of the Lahti L-39, Finland's 20mm anti-tank monster that the world forgot. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this weapon was both a masterpiece of engineering and a nightmare to actually use. To understand the Lahti L-39, we need to go back to November 30th, 1939. Finland, a nation of just 3.7 million people, faced an invasion by the Soviet Union, a superpower with a population of 170 million. The odds? Impossible. The Soviet plan? Overwhelming force. They rolled in with thousands of tanks, T-26s, T-28s, and the heavy KV-1s. The Finnish army had virtually no tanks of their own. They had brave soldiers, intimate knowledge of their frozen forests, and a desperate need for weapons that could stop Soviet armor. Enter Aimo Lahti, one of Finland's most brilliant firearms designers. This man had already designed the Suomi KP-31 submachine gun, which was tearing through Soviet infantry with devastating effectiveness. But now, Finland needed something bigger, something that could kill tanks. The problem was time. Finland didn't have years to develop a new weapon. They had weeks, maybe months before the next Soviet offensive. Lahti had to work fast, and he had to work smart. Here's the genius part. Lahti didn't start from scratch. He took the action from a Solothorn S-18 1000 20mm anti-tank rifle, a Swiss design that Finland had purchased, and completely redesigned it for Finnish needs. He stripped it down, reinforced it, added features that would help Finnish soldiers survive the brutal winter conditions, and created something entirely new. The result? The Lahti L-39 was born in 1939, right in the middle of the Winter War. Let me paint you a picture of this absolute unit of a weapon. The Lahti L-39 fired a 20 by 138mm B cartridge. For context, a standard rifle round is maybe 7.62mm. We're talking about a projectile nearly 3 times that diameter. This thing fired rounds originally designed for anti-aircraft cannons. The weapon weighed 109 pounds, that's 49.5 kilograms, without its detachable skis or wheels. With the mounting system, you're looking at close to 150 pounds of Finnish fury. The barrel alone was over 51 inches long. The entire weapon stretched to about 7 feet 4 inches. You couldn't carry this thing like a normal rifle. It wasn't meant to be carried. It was meant to be positioned, set up, and fired from a prepared location. But here's where Lahti's genius really shines. He knew Finnish soldiers would be fighting in snow that could be several feet deep, in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So the L-39 came with detachable skis for easy movement through snow. When you needed to relocate quickly, you could attach these skis, and 2 soldiers could pull it like a sled. It also had wheels, proper pneumatic tires, for moving across roads or frozen ground. This wasn't just a gun, it was a mobile weapons platform. The L-39 used a semi-automatic action with a unique gas operation system and a vertically tilting bolt. This meant experienced crews could fire between 10 to 15 rounds per minute. That's insanely fast for a weapon of this caliber. It fed from a 10-round detachable box magazine that sat on top of the weapon. The magazines themselves were works of art, precision machined to ensure reliable feeding even in sub-zero conditions. And here's a feature that sounds minor but was absolutely crucial. The L-39 had a muzzle brake. Firing a 20mm round generates enormous recoil. We're talking forces that could break bones if not properly managed. The muzzle brake redirected gases to reduce felt recoil and keep the weapon on target. Lahti even included a pistol grip and a shoulder stock. Though calling it a shoulder-fired weapon is generous, you could technically fire it from the shoulder, but you'd regret it immediately. Most crews use the bipod at the front and the support at the rear, firing from a prone position. So how did it actually perform in combat? The numbers are staggering. At 100 meters, the L-39 could penetrate 20 millimeters of armor at a 90-degree angle and 15 millimeters at 60 degrees. At 300 meters, it still punched through 15 millimeters of perpendicular armor. This was enough to destroy most Soviet light and medium tanks of the era from the side or rear, and even damage heavier vehicles. But raw penetration numbers don't tell the whole story. The psychological impact was immense. Imagine you're a Soviet tank crew. You're buttoned up inside a T-26, thinking you're safe behind several millimeters of steel armor. Suddenly, there's a sound like a lightning strike, and a 20-millimeter projectile tears through your tank's side armor. The round doesn't just penetrate, it brings shrapnel, spalling metal, and concussive force into your cramped crew compartment. Finnish soldiers nicknamed it Norsupyssy, elephant gun. Soviet tankers called it other things, none of them polite. The L-39 saw heavy use during the Winter War from 1939 to 1940, and then again during the Continuation War from 1941 to 1944. Finnish sources document numerous tank kills attributed to L-39 crews. One particularly skilled team reportedly destroyed 7 Soviet tanks in a single engagement. But the weapon had vulnerabilities. First, it was heavy and cumbersome. While the skis and wheels helped, repositioning the weapon under fire was extremely difficult. Once you set up an L-39 position, you were committed to that location. If Soviet infantry spotted you or called in artillery, you had to abandon the weapon or risk being killed. Second, the 20-millimeter rounds were expensive and difficult to manufacture. Finland's industrial capacity was limited, so ammunition was often in short supply. Crews had to make every shot count. Third, as the war progressed and Soviet armor got thicker, especially with tanks like the KV-1 and later the T-34, the L-39's effectiveness diminished against frontal armor. It remained deadly against side and rear shots, but engaging a tank head-on became increasingly risky. Here's something most people don't know. The Lahti L-39 had several experimental variants that never made it to full production. The L-39-44 was an improved version developed late in the war with a modified gas system and better ergonomics. Only a handful were produced before the armistice with the Soviet Union. There were also experiments with different ammunition types. Beyond the standard armor-piercing rounds, Finnish engineers developed high-explosive incendiary rounds for use against aircraft and light vehicles. Tracer rounds helped crews adjust fire. Some sources even mention experimental tungsten core penetrators, though documentation is scarce. Perhaps most fascinating, and this is where we get into the truly experimental territory, there are reports of captured L-39s being modified by German forces. Germany, always hungry for effective anti-tank weapons, allegedly tested Finnish-supplied L-39s on the Eastern Front. Some were supposedly fitted to light vehicles as improvised anti-tank guns, though photographic evidence is almost non-existent. The Japanese also expressed interest in the design. Finland and Japan had oddly cordial relations during the war. Both were fighting the Soviets, after all. There are unconfirmed reports of design specifications being shared, but no evidence that Japan ever manufactured their own version. After the wars with the Soviet Union ended, Finland's relationship with the L-39 became complicated. The 1944 Moscow Armistice and subsequent Paris Peace Treaty placed severe restrictions on Finnish military capabilities. Finland was required to limit its armed forces and couldn't maintain certain categories of weapons. Technically, the L-39 fell into a gray area. It wasn't quite artillery, wasn't quite a standard infantry weapon. The Finnish Defense Forces kept L-39s in inventory well into the 1950s, using them primarily for training and as potential defense weapons in case of another Soviet invasion. Some were converted for use against light vehicles and bunkers, roles where their massive 20-millimeter rounds still proved devastatingly effective. By the 1960s, most were retired from frontline service. Some ended up in museums, others were sold to collectors, particularly in the United States, where Class III firearms dealers could legally acquire them as destructive devices.
Today, functioning L-39s are extremely rare. Collectors who own them prize them as some of the most powerful semi-automatic weapons a civilian can legally own in certain jurisdictions. Ammunition is scarce and expensive, when you can find it at all. Several military museums preserve L-39s as examples of Finland's innovative defensive weapons. The Military Museum of Finland in Helsinki has several on display, complete with their ski and wheel attachments. So why don't we hear more about the Lahti L-39? Why isn't it as famous as the German Panzerfaust or the American bazooka? Several reasons. First, production numbers were relatively small. Finland manufactured approximately 1,900 L-39s during the war years. Compare that to tens of thousands of Panzerfausts or bazookas, and you can see why it remained obscure. Second, Finland's wars with the Soviet Union were overshadowed by the larger conflict between Germany and the Allies. The Winter War and Continuation War are footnotes in most Western history books, despite being absolutely crucial to Finland's survival as an independent nation. Third, Cold War politics. After World War II, nobody in the West wanted to celebrate weapons used against the Soviet Union, who were now supposed to be our complicated allies. Finland itself walked a diplomatic tightrope, maintaining independence while avoiding provoking Soviet anger. But make no mistake, the Lahti L-39 was a masterpiece of pragmatic engineering. Aimo Lahti designed exactly what Finland needed: a powerful, mobile, reliable anti-tank weapon that could be manufactured with limited industrial capacity and operated effectively in the world's harshest winter conditions. It was a weapon born of desperation, refined by necessity, and wielded by soldiers defending their homeland against impossible odds. The Allies never wanted you to know these weapons existed? Maybe. Or maybe we just forgot to look beyond the major powers and their mass-produced arsenals. Because sometimes the most innovative solutions come from the smallest nations facing the biggest threats. The Lahti L-39, Finland's elephant gun that stopped Soviet tanks dead in their frozen tracks.
Smash that like button and subscribe for more secrets like this. See you next time.